Take it away, Lacey.
Okay. Well, welcome to the Pioneer of Pinot seminar by Davis Bynum, and thank you for tuning in to our final event of the World of Pinot Noir Wapen Wine Month. I'm Lacey Johns. I represent the world of Pinot Noir, and we are so happy with the amount of support and participation we've seen over the last month from Pinot Noir lovers around the world. We know it's a little bit different on a virtual platform, and we're excited to see how many people are still enjoying our brands of Pinot Noir. And we're even more excited to have the month be wrapped up by Davis Bynum. If you're familiar with our event, you know that Davis Bynum likes to bring us some unique content every year. And so we're excited for this seminar this evening as we finish off the month. As a reminder, all seminar recordings are available on our website at worldofpinotnoir.com. You go to the Wapen Wine Month tab and there's a little virtual recording section. And so all of our seminars from the whole month will be on there, including this one, probably by tomorrow. But if you want to see anything that you missed, feel free. And save the date for next year. We're hoping to be back at the Ritz-Carlton Bacara next year for World of Pinot Noir, March 3rd through the 6th, 2022. And I'll hand it over. Let me introduce you guys. On the left, we have Ron Washam, wine educator. And on the right, we have Greg Morthel, the winemaker for Davis Bynum.
Oh, thanks, Lacey. Thanks very much. I'm Davis. This is Bynum. It's our comedy team here, Davis and Bynum. I'm Ron Washam, wine educator here at Rodney Strong / Davis Bynum / everything else. And Greg Morthel is obviously the winemaker of the Davis Bynum wines. And we have a couple really terrific. We were just tasting these right before we went on. Tasting good. So we're proud to be a part of the world of Pinot Noir again. Founded in 2000, no kidding. Has it been that long? Wow. The world's planet's foremost Pinot Noir wineries. And winemakers, chefs, sommeliers, and leading wine scholars. That's me. Thank you for joining us, by the way. Davis was certainly one of the real, genuine, actual, everybody's a pioneer on these things. But Davis certainly is among Russian River Pinot Noir producers, one of the great pioneers and also one of the great men. Greg and I both knew him and we're very fond of him. Davis produced, he had the first tasting room in the Russian River. He opened that in 1965. There was nobody out. I don't know who he saw that first year. I never got to ask him. He probably only saw like 12 people for the whole year.
65, yeah, he saw a bunch of college kids down in Berkeley.
Yeah. He'd serve anybody. No, he wouldn't. And he made the first single vineyard Pinot Noir in 1973 from his neighbor's vineyard. His neighbor was Joe Rocchioli. And he had the chance to make some Pinot Noir from Joe's fruit. It was the 73 Davis Bynum Rocchioli Allen vineyard. The Allens are right next door to the Rocchiolis. There's not even a fence between the properties, so the Rocchiolis farm it all. Wonderful. I never had that wine. I wish I'd had it, but that was a long time ago. I was around, but I didn't have it. And when Davis sold his vineyard and his winery, it's now called Thomas George Estates, he was thrilled to sell his name and his brand to the nice folks here, the Klein family that owns Rodney Strong Vineyards. They'd known each other. Tom, you see Tom Klein in the middle picture there with Greg and Davis on the right. They were old friends. Davis was thrilled to death to sell his name to a family-owned winery. When he talked to me about it, he had tears in his eyes. He was so thrilled, so happy. So we're happy to honor him because he was my landlord for my first year I lived here. And I'd known him before that, but living with him on his property and being able to talk to him all the time and hear the stories of how he started. And he had a remarkable life and he was a remarkable man. Well, we can move on. We'll talk about him a little bit more. We'll get Greg to chime in. Greg was very close to Davis too. And then we'll talk about clothes. But let reminisce a little bit about Davis, how you met him and how you came into all this.
Yeah, gosh. So I started at Rodney Strong in 2005, and then we bought Davis Bynum in 2007. And yeah, Tom knew Davis going way back. Tom Klein and the Klein family owned Rodney Strong and Davis Bynum. Tom was working for McKinsey, a consulting company, and he was up here at Rodney Strong. This goes back into the 80s and before the family decided to buy Rodney Strong. And in the meantime, after working here at the winery with Rod and with my emeritus boss Rick Sayre, he would go out and do a little wine tasting. So he told me, and so he swung by Davis's winery and just had a little glass after work, and so he got to know Davis there. And then years later, they were in London together, and I believe they were peopling a table together at a wine fair there in London. And so they were just having fun and got to talking. And Davis basically told Tom that one of these days he might want to sell his brand and his winery. And Tom said, well, one of these days maybe we'd love to talk about that. And so all those years later it happened. And anyway, I came along in 2005 and then started making the Davis Bynum wines in 2010. And I got to know Davis, to answer your question, Ron.
Yeah, I know you did.
In 2011, when I think it was later 2011, when we had kind of an all-employee dinner on the green that we do every year here with our sales staff. And Davis Bynum and his lovely wife, Virginia, were there. And I was seated at the table with them, my wife as well. So the four of us just really hit it off, and we were talking about traveling and this and that and the other thing. And I just got to know basically right away between Davis and Virginia, I got to know how worldly they were, how just experienced and worldly they were, and just how wonderful they were to be around. So he ended up becoming my friend from an older generation. Yeah, it was a really wonderful time.
He is a terrific guy. Always smart, always interesting to be around, always funny. A real character, and we all miss him. We had a great party for him, a wake here on the property after he passed away about 4 years ago now, I think.
Yeah.
And everybody who's anybody in Sonoma County and Napa Pinot Noir producers all came because they'd all either worked for him or worked at the winery. They knew him. He'd helped them.
Yeah.
We're talking all the big shots, every cult winery you can name.
And they
all showed up to honor Davis.
And those people, a lot of them brought some old
wines that
they had.
A lot of old wines.
I saw a bunch of old wines I've never seen before.
Me neither.
It just was one of those wonderful things that can happen, when you're going to a celebration of life, as you're rediscovering all these other things that they've done. And so, Davis has just been around for a long time. He made all kinds of wines from all kinds of people.
So if you talk about Pinot Noir in the Russian River, and even in California, Davis was in on it very early. There were only a few people. Rodney Strong was one of them, and you had a few other folks that were planting Pinot Noir. And in Russian River was really just people like the Rocciolis and Joe Swan and Davis and Rod, and those were the guys that put Pinot Noir out here and sold it as Pinot Noir and made Pinot Noir in an era. I'm old, believe me. You went to a restaurant in 1970, in the mid 70s, you could not buy a bottle of California Pinot Noir off the list because pretty much it didn't exist and nobody wanted it. So you had a very few cult places like Hansel maybe, but other than that, it didn't exist. And now, there's countless people and everybody wants Russian River Pinot Noir. So that, and it really was Davis, one of his vision, and that he was out there and he loved Pinot Noir and he knew about Pinot Noir because he was worldly. He knew about Burgundy. He knew what Pinot Noir should taste like. It wasn't a crapshoot for him. So with that, that's just a little bit. We could talk about Davis all day. I always like to tell a line he's famous for, which I always get a kick out of, which is he used to say that any idiot can make wine. He just better be a tireless idiot. Davis was tireless, but he was far from an idiot, that's for sure.
And then he'd look at me after saying that sometimes.
Then he'd look at you, apparently lazy idiots can make wine too. So let's go on to the next, talk about clones. We have these two different clones of Pinot Noir. The vineyard these came from is our Jane's Vineyard, which is sort of in the middle of the Russian River. And I think there are 9 clones of Pinot Noir planted on the vineyard. Is that right?
Yeah, 9 clones, yes.
So we have two represented here. For us, on our left, we have the 2018 clone 667, and then we have the 2017 clone 23, very different clones. But if I get asked this all the time at work, there's a little map of Jane's. You can see there's just a little bit of 23 there on the bottom.
Yeah, about 5 acres. Yeah.
Yeah, and 667, is that all just up? I can't see.
667's up at the very top, that triangular piece there. This is about 11 acres of that.
There you go. So and you can see all the other clones that we have planted, a little Sauvignon Blanc as well. So let's talk about what makes it a clone. I mean, what are we talking about when we're talking about clones? So what does that botanically? What does that mean?
Yeah, it's kind of I have a hard time like wrapping this up very briefly, so you have to rein me in a little. But it's kind of a cool thing. But you you essentially if you use what the dog analogy, you've got all these dog breeds around the world, right? Everybody loves dogs. I mean, cats, dogs. You can pick what you want. Tomatoes. So it's as if you all the grapes that are made into wine are Vitis vinifera. That's not entirely true, actually. There's a few others that's very unusual and rare. So that's mind that, but fact check that a little. But like all of the upper tier and worldly wines of the world are Vitis vinifera. It's thought that there's maybe 10,000 different varietals, something like that.
Yep.
Varieties. So that's what Jancis Robinson says, I think, in her book. Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir is obviously very important to the world. It was, I believe, the 5th plant that was genetically cloned back in 2007. So if you're talking about all the plants that grow in the world, the fact that Pinot Noir was the 5th one that was genetically fingerprinted is saying a lot.
Yeah.
And the fact they chose Pinot Noir to do it.
Money.
Yeah. So getting onto what is a clone anyway, and using the dog analogy again, if it's like as if Pinot Noir is grown around the world and it's grown very well, although in very select areas around the world. So widespread, but in very, very select, smaller appellations, right? The Russian River famously being a world-class one of those. In Burgundy, but you've got Central Otago, it's around up in Austria, but
Switzerland.
In Switzerland, yes, and we'll get to that here too in a little bit. But Pinot, because as it migrated around the world and because of the passage of time, it's thought that the Pinot Noir genetically mutated and has led to these different expressions. So originally, people sought out. Actually, I think there's really 2 camps here: the French camp and the American camp. In France, they sought out different types of Pinot Noir because they were looking for higher organoleptic qualities, so more tasty wine. In America, we generally, as I've read anyway, going back into the 50s, 60s, 70s, we were looking at different types of Pinot Noir for, in the beginning, so that there were better yields, so that there was less disease pressure and all those things. That was a concern in France too, I know. But I think they had more of a push to look at the organoleptic properties of the wine.
I'll chime in if you don't mind.
No.
Let me jump in. So from my understanding is, everything he's saying is right, but the first clones of Pinot Noir were actually done in Germany back in the 1920s. Later on, the French started to figure out they wanted to do clones. So they wanted to, basically, they started in the 1950s. It was a much cooler planet, as we all know, back in the 1950s. So their concern with the particular Pinot clones that they wanted to propagate was sugar accumulation and early ripening. This was to combat how cold it was. If you find the clones that ripen early, accumulate sugar quickly, and you use those in your vineyard, you have a better chance of having a great crop every year. Once they got that established, then you start working on other clones that maybe add color, then add tannin structure. So then you've got that in your toolkit, and then they moved on in this, like he's talking about the 70s and 80s, into the aromatics, the organoleptic qualities, the more perfumey, more aromatic sorts of Pinot Noir clones. And in Germany and Switzerland, their concern was, of course, how wet they are. So they were looking for clones that had looser structure.
Clusters,
yeah, looser clusters, so they wouldn't get as much mold and mildew issues. So they all sort of converged into, and a clone is basically, the way we're talking about clonal selection, right? You're more of this than I do, but there's originally one mother plant, and you propagate from that.
From a cutting.
Yeah. Always, and propagate from those cuttings, so that you always have the same DNA. That's what they first started doing in Germany in the 1920s, and then more in the 1950s in France and everywhere else. Go ahead.
As opposed to using a grape. So if you took a grape and you planted it, you get a vine. But what's the grape? The grape is a propagation, is a seed, has a seed in it that was a result of potentially, being wind pollinated or insect pollinated from different plants, right? So if you grab a grape and you plant a vine, you don't know that you've got a clone of the plant that grape came off of. But if you actually notch one of the buds off of that vine, and then you go graft it onto another vine, now you've got a clone from that mother and then daughter vine.
It's the same thing.
That's how it was done.
Yeah, same thing you do with roses.
So, yeah.
And apparently dogs. You cut off the
well, in the dog analogy,
cut off the leg of the dog, and you grow another dog.
That's probably a bad analogy, but on the dog, I'll wrap dog analogy up real quick. So you have dogs, right? It's like grapes. But then you've got different breeds of dogs. So you got German Shepherds and Schnauzers and all the different. My wife's more of a dog person, so you've got all these different breeds. Those would be akin to Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Cabernet, Malbec, and everything else. Now let's say you've got Dachshunds, right? So now you've got Dachshunds. You got little wiener dogs. So you got a Dachshund from the Russian River. You got a Dachshund from Burgundy. And you got a Dachshund from Germany. And Australia.
You're getting the weeds here, man.
Now I'm in way deep in the weeds.
You're losing it now.
And now I'm saying you put all those dachshunds in the same room and you find they're different. And that's what I'm talking about. They're a little different.
You got a room full of dachshunds.
You got a room full of dachshunds, and they're all a little different, and that's the analogy. So
are they?
That's kind of how weird it is in a way.
Are they self-pollinating dachshunds? This is maybe the worst analogy in the history of. It's a good thing we're the last one on Wopen because we're closing it with
we're getting punchy
nonsense. No, we're just having fun.
But that is a clone, yeah, and then you select it. So this was done in France. It was done at UC Davis. It was done in Germany.
And we have two examples of that, really. Yeah. The 667 is what's known as a Dijon, one of the Dijon clones, meaning it was developed in France at the University of Dijon in particular, and one of the really wonderful clones for its richness and spiciness and kind of soft tannic structure, and really a beautiful clone. And then you have the other one we're serving is the clone 23, which was originally brought to UC Davis by Harold Omo back in the 1950s, and he developed what's now called Clone 23, and also a really wonderful clone. But because, well, we'll talk about the clones as we go on, the two different wines and what's different. If you have both wines and you can taste them side by side, that's probably the best way to compare them, because you really get a sense of how different clones are, because they're wildly different. Greg's kind enough some years to bring over 9 different clones from the same vineyard, and they taste them separately, and they can be wildly different.
Yeah, and some of those, many of them have numbers. It's just an easy system. If you take a whole bunch of plants from mother vines, and then you come back to your vineyard and you take those buds from all these different vineyards from everywhere, and then you graft them onto these vines grown in your vineyard, now you got a whole bunch of different clones grown in your vineyard. So the easiest thing to do is obviously number them. There are clones, or what are called clones, that are kind of it's more of a selection that have names. So you'll hear Pomar and you hear Swan and Calera. And so some of those are also now legit clones. They've been run through the system where they do things at the university with heat treatment or meristem shoot tip culturing, where they can rid the vine of viruses. And so they're interested in that. We're all interested in having cleaner plant material. But some of those are actually just propagations. Like if I went to Ron's vineyard, Ron wishes he had a vineyard, but anyway, if I went to Ron's imaginary
I got a dachshund though.
If I went to Ron's imaginary vineyard and then he allowed me, or maybe he didn't, I just went in there at midnight, let's say, this is more apropos.
I have guard dachshunds.
And then I took a bunch of buds off of different plants, came back and planted my vineyard. That would be called a Massal selection. Right. And so that's where my vineyard would now just kind of trying to replicate what he was doing with his wines in his vineyard, because I just liked it so much, as I do Ron. So
yeah, there you go. Yeah. He brought up an interesting point too, when Harold Omo went and collected these vine cuttings from Burgundy and ultimately Switzerland too. In California, they were interested in getting rid of virus. That was their main goal. They had warmth, they had warmer temperature. They had fewer issues than the French did with ripening and sugar accumulation. So he created this heat treatment where he would just heat the vines so the viruses would die, and you would have virus-free plants.
Yeah, for a long time, months.
For months, yeah, they treat them for a very long time, and then they would grow them and propagate them. Pomar went several different ways. He ended up with what's now the Pomar clone, which is all over Oregon and all over California.
Yeah.
And that was originally Harold Olmo at UC Davis in the 50s. So it's all pretty interesting history. Richard Wallace, who's on a lot of these calls. I know your name, Richard. You're hiding, but hi again. Nice to see you. Thanks for always participating. We love having you here. Next time you're at the winery, come say hi. We'll make him come out and say hi and bring his dachshunds. I'm done with the dachshund jokes now. Thank you. Are the different clones propagated through cuttings or tissue culture? As far as I know, cuttings, but you know.
Originally it's cuttings, so you get the clones through cuttings, yeah. And
do they do tissue culture now at all? No.
Well, tissue culture would be done only in the beginning. So essentially, once the cuttings go into the university system, it's Foundation Plant Services at Davis, and then there's a system in Dijon, and I'm sure in Germany and around the world. There's at the universities typically. So they'll take the plant material in, they'll graft them onto their vines and their experimental vineyards. They will make wines out of them. At the same time, they'll grow enough of it and start doing these heat treatments. Or I think more modern days now, they'll do the tissue culture where they do the meristem. Basically, the very tip cells of the plant as it's growing outgrows the virus. It's a race, and the plant is growing, and the virus is kind of catching up. If that plant has a virus in the first place, right? So, but at that very tip cells, those don't have virus, so they'll cut those out, and then somehow they propagate that and can actually, fortunately for plants or for vines anyway, they can grow that into a whole new plant. You can't do that with all living things for some reason, but you can with grapevines, fortunately. So they are propagated through cuttings, and then they do that meristem culturing to rid it of virus much of the time. And then what we would do as a winery would be we would buy clone 667 or whatever clone from a nursery that got their stock from the university.
So there you go. So sometimes it starts with tissue culture.
Yeah.
But from then on, it's mostly cuttings.
But people still will go to a friend's vineyard and take cuttings, and do a Massal selection. So that's still done. But that would be called a selection and not a clone, because you're taking a bunch of buds and you're planting a huge vineyard from a bunch of different mother plants, whereas with the cloning, you're taking buds off of one plant, and then you're growing from there.
Right. So it all for a true clone like that, it all traces back to one mother plant.
And basically, I don't know if they know where any of those mother vines are for any of these clones.
I wouldn't think so.
Clone 667, though, the Dijon clones, I'm told that they came from mother vines, different mother vines, but in the Clos de la Roche vineyard. Domaine Ponceau, Clos de Roche vineyard, Grand Cru vineyard in Burgundy. And interestingly so, because they taste pretty different. I mean, again, going back to the numbers, 113 that we grow, we have off that map, we've got 5 acres of 113. I like to make rosé out of it. I didn't prefer it so much for still wine. It was kind of tart and lean and had red fruit, which I liked, but it had kind of an excessive amount of acid and tannins, and actually it makes a really delicious rosé. So we make that into our Davis Bynum Rosé. The 114 is darker fruit. The 115 is more cherry and rose petal.
Pretty fruit, yeah.
And then you've got 667 here and 777. They're all, I'm told, coming from the Clos de la Roche vineyard, but different mother vines. And so if you just think about Burgundy and how old world that is and how long they've been growing vines there, Pinot Noir there for a long time. I mean, what, 1,500 years? More?
At least, yeah.
So, it's a long time. And sometimes when they were propagating vines, I forget the word for this. I saw this in Argentina, though. They would, sometimes if the vine would die, they'd take the vine next to it, take a shoot and just bend it down, put it in the ground, put dirt on top of it, soil that is. Dirt's what's under your fingernails, right?
Yes.
They put soil on top of it, so they say. And then it'll grow roots, and they'll lop off the runner, the cane, and you got your new plant. But that now you would think would be pretty similar to that mother plant, or genetically identical. So if you do that over time, and you've got all these other factors such as UV radiation, which is a factor. We sunburn. and we have problems from that sometimes, right? So this can happen to plants too. They get genetically damaged sometimes or change mutations. And so anyway, that's really
Yeah. Let's not forget that in a way. The plants change too in different environments. You have epigenetic change. You have 667 that's been in California, been in Sonoma for a long time. Even if they plant the same 667 up in the Willamette Valley over the course of decades, they're very different wines at that point.
Yeah.
And you never can take the winemaker out of the equation. What bricks you picked it at and what barrels you use and all the winemaking techniques. So to say 667 always tastes like this is sort of maybe our 667 always tastes like that.
Yeah.
But so really you're talking about structure, like it ripens quickly. It has high sugars or high acid. It has it's really tannic or it's less tannic. Very general things about clones tend to be more useful than being more specific about them.
Yeah, it's kind of a range. I'd say like 667's got this range, 777's got this range. Maybe it overlaps a bit, but 115's pretty different. It's over here more that red fruit versus the darker fruit, that type of thing.
So John Valley's asking, he says he's not familiar with our full Pinot offering. I don't know, John, where you been? Catch up, man. These are good wines. Kidding. Do we generally always list the clones used in your wines on the label, even if there are a blend of many clones? Actually, we do. Correct? Yeah, the back of all of our Davis Bynum wines.
Yeah, we've been doing that.
It'll list all this big bottle in the middle here. This is from Jane's, and it lists all 9 clones that he used that year on the back. Mm-hmm. And then the single clone wines obviously are labeled on the front. I love the 667 too. It's tasting great.
Yeah. But this, what I like about this is if you already know about clones, hopefully we're filling in maybe some little areas that you didn't know, things that you didn't know about the clones and our wines in particular. But if you didn't know about clones, know that, and this is very apropos for the world of Pinot Noir, next year, hopefully, cross our fingers when we're down at Bacara walking around, you'll hear other people asking and other winemakers and viticulturists down there chatting about the clones that they're using in the wines. It does seem to be more important for the world of Pinot at large than it does for people who make other varietals. And I mean, I've made Cab and all those other wines as well. And there are clones, of course, of all varietals. But
I like your smooth world of Pinot Noir segue.
That's great.
Nice
but
segue.
It's just it's very important to us who make Pinot Noir and who enjoy Pinot Noir. So ask your producers. It's a really interesting thing, and then you can really compare. When
you go to tasting rooms, it's an interesting thing to ask because you end up figuring it out. If the more you taste and the more you start to spot the clones. Sometimes at least this got to be 667 or 777. Pomar is kind of in the same place for me too. That same sort of flavor profile and structure. But I had something else that went away. Okay, let's talk about
how these wines taste.
Let's talk about the wines.
How about that?
So we have the 18. We're tasting. We're going to do the 18667 Foist.
Yeah, 2 different vintages. We should point out.
Right. This is
the
18. Right.
Same vineyard, same soil, same climate, but 2 different weather patterns because they're 2 different years. So
that's true too. Right. That makes sense.
So
that obviously has an effect. So 667 is one of those clones that's relatively all over the place in California. I'd say
pretty popular.
Yeah, because it has the. This is a pretty young Pinot Noir, and it's still the tannins aren't harsh. It's got the acid's a little bit. You have lower acidity, higher pH,
softer.
It's
a little more oily.
Yep. And that's I don't know. Did you pick them at the same bricks level? These two? Do you have any memory of that?
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious because that toffee's a huge effect on the wine.
Yes, it does actually. I've studied that a little bit.
Yeah, you used to make a little bit from each clone.
Back
different bricks.
2013, we did a little study. Yeah, it was interesting. Picked at 23 bricks, 24 bricks, 25 bricks. Bricks, BRIX, is a measurement of sugar. I know it's a weird thing, but it's one of those other anomalies in the wine industry. Mm-hmm. So 23 bricks did make a wine that was about 13.6% alcohol. Mm-hmm. Pretty high acid. So we measure acid as TA, total acid or titratable acidity. So pretty high acidity, low pH, which is saying somewhat of a similar thing. A little leaner, rougher on the tannins, a little more earthy, more red fruit. Then 4 days later, we picked around 24 bricks and made a wine that's 14.4% alcohol.
Yeah.
Had that nice middle balance, a balance, right down the middle between having the richness and sweetness that higher alcohol wines bring, and having still hanging on to the acid, lower than the previous pick, but still moderated by it being 4 days later, 4 days of sunshine. And then we picked 4 days after that, made this big monstrous Pinot, delicious in its own right. And there are those who make this style of wine. There's nothing wrong with it, but it was a 15.3 maybe percent alcohol, something like that.
Yeah.
So in the span of 8 days, we went from 13.6 alcohol to one in the middle, 14.4, to one at 15.3. And then the fruit tones went from red to kind of plummy, reddish, blackish fruit, kind of went both directions, interestingly so, and think that I like that, to much more of a darker fruited wine. And we did this with 2 different clones, and just treated them the same, put them in the same barrels and all that stuff. So it was an interesting experiment, but the vintage and the bricks does matter.
Yeah.
And to answer your question, Ron, so the warmer vintage was higher bricks. So the second wine, our second wine on the right, with 2017 Clone 23, was picked at noticeably higher bricks. I think it was about 1.5 bricks higher. And that because you got a warmer vintage, and the sun is just driving sugar accumulation. Interestingly, if it gets warm enough, the stoma will close. Imagine closing your mouth, not such a good thing, but the plants can live through it. You got your nose, I know.
Okay,
imagine closing both. We're going back to, was it dachshunds, right?
No.
No, we're leaving dachshunds behind. So if you the plants have stoma on the bottom of the leaves, and that's how they breathe. And so if you've got enough water coming up through the roots and you've got sunlight, it's going to make some sugar and pump that sugar down to the roots, but also into the berries. If it's warm enough, over 95 degrees, the stoma will close. The plant will keep its moisture. It'll keep from dehydrating. Wisely so. Plants are not dumb. And so it'll shut up shop. It'll close things down anyway, and you won't accumulate sugar so much. But all the way up till that 95, and then when it comes back down, if you got some evening warmth and temperatures drop a little bit, it'll accumulate a little more.
So somebody remarked, I see CAR. I suppose that's Karen. I don't know. I can only see the CAR part. Some car remarked, the 667 reminds me of Gevrey Chambertin, which is right next to Claude de la Roche. So maybe Midnight Raid. You never know. It could have been the other way around. Yeah, maybe Claude de la Roche raided the Gevrey. We don't know. That's a French thing. But I think you're right. It does. I hadn't thought about that. That's actually a really good point. I don't tend to think about, as a recovering sommelier, I should think that way, but I kind of don't. But you're right. It does have a Gevrey character to it. That richness and that kind of little background of, this is tasting good to me.
I find
spice and
Gevrey's, spicy. So, I think the spice kind of reminds me of Gevrey.
Yeah.
The animal.
Yeah, a little bit of earth tones.
Sometimes a little tobacco and stuff like that. Yeah, and then the fruit layers in there. Just that's the thing about Burgundies. It's the homeland for Pinot Noir, and it's just now it's gone worldwide, and I think that the Russian River makes just a classic expression.
Yeah,
but as you pointed out with Davis, it is very, for us here in the Russian River, and it's still at how many years now? 50, 60, 70 years-ish. It's still very nascent for us, I feel. And in France, they've been doing it forever, and they've really got it nailed down, the appellation system.
Yeah, you had the Cistercian monks tending to Pinot Noir in the 12th century, the 1100s. Imagine that. In the 1100s out here, I don't think, was Rod? No, Rod wasn't here in the 1100s. He was old, but now how many clones of Pinot Noir would you say are roughly available?
Like 100.
I think there's about 100.
I think there's more than that. I'd say
which is a lot.
120, 140.
Yeah, which is a lot.
There's a lot.
And the reason for that is not, they used to say before DNA studies were done that Pinot Noir was just mutated more easily than other varieties. That's completely untrue.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
About the mutation? I always took that to be.
No.
It was one of those dogma things. I felt I just kind of latched on.
No, in fact, not. There's no evidence that in Vitis vinifera there's any difference in how prone they are to mutate.
Yeah.
But because Pinot Noir is about the oldest variety that we know of, that we still make wine from.
It's had more time.
It's an ancient variety. I've heard it said by people that would know, that it's maybe 3 or 4 generations removed from the wild grapevines, which of course were not self-pollinating. They were male and female back then, a long time ago. So because Pinot Noir is so old, it's had thousands of years to create more genetic mutations than Cabernet, which is only 350 years old. I don't know how many. There might be 25 Cabernet clones or something. I'm making that number up. I don't know, but nothing like as many as Pinot. Yeah. So I think the 667 is. Somebody mentioned that Nancy loved it. I think you're right, Nancy. Tasting great. It's tasting really beautiful right now.
Yeah, there's a little floral kick in it. I think the fruit. To me, it's pretty fruit centric, but I'm loving this little floral tone. There's a little rose petal that's coming out. Mm-hmm. When I think of 667, often I get a little bit of a black tea. So if you lean on perhaps the spicy character, a little potpourri.
It's gorgeous mouthfeel too.
Yeah, I'd say it's kind of oily. I like that richness. It definitely was picked at lower bricks. But it was also picked a little higher pH, and it's got this kind of rich character for that.
No, I like your descriptions. That's great. But I keep thinking about, imagine, 1,500 years of the monks in Burgundy and the other growers in Burgundy, the people making Burgundy, that when they finally got to this 667 and separated it as a clone. I mean, this is years and years of guys out in the vineyard, paying attention, propagating the plants that made the best wines, the Grey Gevrey Chambertins and the Clos de la Roche. That's astonishing when you drink this wine that was planted about 6 miles south of us, maybe 5 miles. That's where it all started. Those crazy monks. Yeah. Those crazy monks.
Yeah. Ever since they first took a cutting, whenever that was.
Yeah.
Somebody did.
So I said, this makes really good wine. Let's make more of this plant.
Yeah.
That's astonishing to me. That's the joy in wine, is that history and that interest. And, for the most part, when you're doing commercial Pinot Noirs, you very rarely use one clone. We do this for education. We do this for fun. We do this because these make wonderful wines and interesting wines. But certainly, very few people are making their large production Pinot Noir from one clone. Yeah. Our reserve Pinots, like from Rodney Strong, is like 3 clones or something, because in Harmony they make you can do more things. You can add stuff, and that's what's interesting about Pinot Noir making. People often say, well, you blend Cabernet with this, and you blend all these grapes, you do all these blends, but you don't blend Pinot Noir. But in fact, it's just as much work to blend Pinot Noir as it is to blend a Meritage, right? When you've got 8 different clones to blend with.
Yeah, and they can be pretty different. So
they're very different.
The Pomar clone that we grow is very leathery, beautifully leathery. The fruit that's there is kind of this, I'd say cherry. It's more reddish fruit that layers in underneath that kind of a leathery character. So I think I was making a mistake picking the Pomar clone too late, and so now I try to pick it a little earlier. I do pick it a little earlier, but it takes years to kind of come to those conclusions, And it just was kind of getting a little lost with alcohols that were mid 14s or even upper 14s were a little bit much for that wine. It was already rich. It's rich even when you pick it earlier. Yeah. So, and picking it earlier, kind of leaned towards that cherry tone a little more. And then I found that in balance. And especially if you barrel ferment that clone, it just comes out beautifully because it heightens the fruit tones. And then you've got those different things playing at you, the fruit and the savory and spice, and it depends on what you do with the barrels. And so this wine, by the way, the 667 was aged 15 months. You might have seen in Hungarian and French oak. The Hungarian does tend to add a little more spice to it. A couple of years ago, back in 2016, I want to say, I think I started in 15 and then tasted the wines in 2016, 2017. I did a 2-year trial with French and Hungarian oak, and then I kept the best of both. So I'm still using French and I introduced Hungarian cooperage, some of which are made by French coopers, some of which are made by Hungarian coopers, into the wine, and I like it. I just matched it with the wines. Yeah. So some of them lean towards lending some spice into the wines that I like, and more so than the French. The French it's just a well-rounded barrel generally. I mean, you can get a lot of different things out of French oak too. Same species.
Well-rounded.
Yeah, it's the different.
Totally round.
The different oak would be American oak. American oak has a much higher lactones And so we don't tend to use it. We don't use it in our Pinots. Yeah. It just would be a little heavy-handed, you know, with the coconut aromas. And
most people don't use it on Pinot very much.
Not too much. I've seen it done,
but not very often. Yeah, because it does get really strange.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the clone 23, 2017. So 23, as we spoke of, came to California via Harold Olmo, one of the great viticulture guys in the history of the world, much less California. A very important man in the history of wine growing and viticulture. And so 23. Well, let's talk about 23. Because it evolved in a Swiss climate, it tends to be thicker skinned, right?
Yes, I believe so. It's thicker skinned. It's larger clusters. I don't know about more berries, but the actual cluster is noticeably bigger. I mean, like twice the size of the clone 667. Yeah, the 667. The word for Pinot means essentially, I think it's an ancient word. It's derivative of pine cone or pine. So it's like if you imagine a pine cone the size of your fist, this would be like the 667, more or less. You can get a lot of variation, but it's like that on the Dijon clones in particular. The clone 23s you're talking about like this. They're bigger clusters.
Size of a dachshund.
So, yeah.
Shut up.
Giant dachshund.
Sorry.
So the berries are bigger, but they're also more separated. The cluster will shake. The cluster will move. If you pick a cluster off and wiggle it, it'll shake like this versus a tight cluster that you have with 667. So with Dijon clones, if you see rain in the forecast, you know, it can be a problem for those tighter clustered Pinots. And so that is very much a clone difference, and it will cause me to for several different things. If there's a heat wave coming, I can think of 2010. This happened, big heat wave coming in September, and we had to choose what we were going to pick. Things were getting ripe. Right. We went to the Dijon clones because they ripen earlier,
quick, yeah,
and they were meant to, as you mentioned earlier, and because you need that in a cooler climate, you want them to ripen earlier. For us, same thing. If you've got rain or whatever, in the 2010 vintage, though, it was a cool vintage all the way up till later August. We got a heat wave, and then kind of second week of September, I think it was, we had a big heat wave coming in. So we went out and picked all the Dijon clones, including the 667, and we left on purpose the Swiss clones to hang. And so they dried up a little bit, but they held on a lot better than the Dijon clones would.
Yeah.
So there's a good reason if you to plant different clones in your vineyard. One of which is so you have different blending material organoleptically, you know, different interest factors you can blend together. But another one is so you can actually, if you have an issue like that coming, rain or heat or whatever, then you can choose to do that.
Yeah, to me, interesting. We were tasting these before we came on the air just to talk about and taste them for fun. Even though the 1723 is a year older, it has so much more acidity to it. And that's the nature of the clone. That's not the winemaking particularly. It is a little bit, but you could tell the 23 because of that high acid. That's just part of what it's about. You know, that's a good thing. That's what you use it when you blend, I assume, is for a little bit of acidity and a little bit of
and tannins. Got a little
tannins. Yeah. It's a for a Pinot Noir. It's relatively tannic.
Yeah. Do you guys get a little bite on it? I'm hoping I see. I can't see people, but
yeah, they've all left. They're not even here anymore. Right?
Yeah. But higher tannins, higher acid. We did pick this at higher bricks. But that's where I want to separate, because in 2017, to contrast the vintages for a second here, 2017 was a very warm vintage, very warm. I wouldn't have chosen it. I love how the wines turned out. So looking back on it, I'm very happy with how things turned out. At the time, though, and I can tell you on Labor Day in particular in 2017, it was 108, was it that day?
Something like that.
So
the whole weekend was brutal.
And you're talking about Pinot is a thin-skinned varietal. Yeah. The Swiss clones being, I think, thicker skinned than the Dijon clones. They can handle that a little more, but I wouldn't choose a heat spiky year like that, notably for Pinot Noir. And yet, you know, it turned out like we loved all the wines that we made. There is some tannins in that 17. It is a year younger. Yep. It's probably due to the heat of that vintage, because I find that with hotter years come more tannins. And it also clearly, to me, and I know this from making these wines many years, it comes from the clone itself and the thicker skins.
Yeah, Nancy says less fruit. That's not how I would express it exactly, Nancy. I think there's plenty of fruit in there. It's just going to take a lot longer to show up. Because 667 has lower acidity, and the fruit tends to jump out at you immediately, even when they're really young. They're juicy and they're spicy and they're delicious. And 23 is just more reticent because that high acid. It might, if we tasted these again 5 years from now, you might find the 23 far more interesting. I don't know that. There's pretty good fruit in there.
Yeah,
It's just different. It's not spicy. It's a little spicy on the nose, but for me on the palate, it's just more pure red fruit. I get a little spice, but also you get the tannins and the acidity.
I agree largely with you, Nancy. Yeah, I think the 667 is coming. The fruit is coming out. I find that basket of fruit and the richness, the oiliness, and the 23, Clone 23 with the warmer year. I'm finding that the tannins are there. It's more of an age-worthy wine. I think the Clone 667 is one to drink a little. I would age both, but I would enjoy probably the Clone 667 a little earlier than the 23. I think it drinks really well right now, but I'm with you, Ron. I think the fruit for me is coming out on the palate, less so on the nose. The nose, I get spice. It's like a.
Well, I'm just thinking, there's
spice
spice on the nose. I get less of the. We're all different. We all taste different stuff. But some of you made Clone 23 in 2015, right? And 16.
And
15 and 16, I think. And I just had the 16 the other day, and it was really starting to shine. Although that wasn't as hot a vintage. And so that's always what you're talking about is the weather. 16 was a beautiful, mellow, gorgeous vintage. Yeah. And that wine's showing it. I mean, now it's shining now. But a couple of years ago, I wasn't in love with it. Now I think it's really good.
Yeah, 16 was kind of a sleeper vintage for me. Just in a lot of the wines that we've made here, actually, it wasn't just the Pinot Noirs. It's kind of an interesting sleeper vintage. I thought those wines really showed up late to the party, and when they did, they were ready to go.
Yeah,
so
terrific stuff.
But the 17 a year older, but warmer vintage, and very moderate. I mean, average yields. The 2018 Clone 667 was a much more mild year. But it was the yields out in the vineyards were much higher as well. And I want to note that because that will, Mother Nature's, how many clusters you get on a vine. Generally, you'll get 2 per shoot. Sometimes you get some second crop that can kind of slow things down a little bit. And you don't want to pick that. So most of the time you go through and drop that crop off so the pickers don't accidentally pick it. And so in 2018, anyway, we had huge yields in reality. It was, I think, one of the largest yielding vintages in Sonoma County's history. There was a couple of large yielding vintages going back a few years, 2009, I think 2005 might have been one. So those kind of changed things too. Notably, the 23 usually picks later than the Clone 667, but we are talking about different vintages and different yields because of that. And the 667 picked later than the 23 by about 4 or 5 days, given that it was a different year. But that's unusual.
Yeah, not a heat year, so it doesn't get super ripe as like it wants to because it's so cool. It just mellow. It's probably made a great wine. I don't remember. He makes so many clones. I can't keep them.
We make all the clones, and then we choose 2 to put in the bottle for you.
Yeah, they fight over it and yell and argue, and it's a lot of fun.
Should point out both of these are unfiltered into the bottle.
That's right.
So there's kind of an attitude towards leaving it all on the playing field there. It
also means you can't have any at all residual sugar at all if you don't filter it.
Yeah, I mean
so they're bone dry. You can't, if you leave any sugar at all and you don't filter, then you're going to get fermentation in the bottle and have all kinds of issues.
So we let it go all the way through. Done a lot of native yeast fermentations. So both of these were inoculated, is my recollection. I know the 667 was. I believe the Clone 23 was as well. For both the primary fermentation and the secondary fermentation, which is called malolactic fermentation. But both went unfiltered into the bottle. And the Clone 23, I can tell you, I remember that we did that unfined as well. At the tail end of a wine's life, you have the option of adding the various protein agents to the wine to help bind tannins and settle them out. So another factor for the Clone 23 is, I'd have to go back to my notes, but I think I always taste before bottling and obviously throughout élevage and aging the wine through barrels. and it must have tasted nice to me and just balanced because we didn't find it. And it's something that I always check out. So I always do a trial, but I taste blind, and not everybody does. I think it's something it's a little different for us because most people that I know, they like to know what they're tasting. For me, years ago, maybe around 2015 or 14, I started tasting blind because it just was a way of taking your bias out of it, out of the equation, and you really were left with just the glasses on the table and your own palate. And that's the way, in the end, when I blend the wines, I do it blind. And when I do the finding trials, actually, I do it blind. So the control tasted great, and that's what we wanted. The 667 we did find. So we used probably egg whites. It's a common finding agent. Might sound a little funny, but as a protein, it doesn't stay in the wine, by the way. But as a protein, you put a little bit into the wine, it binds with tannins, it settles out, and you let that settle out nice, and you rack right off.
So that answers your Nancy's question. It's not, why is it not so clear, the 23? That's from not fining. Fining is for clarity. Filtering is to get the yeast and bacteria out of there to go away so you don't have any problems later. That's the simple way to explain it. So if you don't fine it, you're going to get sometimes a little tiny bit of cloudiness. That's usually a good thing. It means they didn't find it. But you got to be, it can be risky not to do that. But on a small production, this is only a few hundred cases.
I brought something for you. I got to run up here. So I'll show you a picture of Davis. This is my buddy. So there's Davis Bynum, guys.
There it is.
And wonderful gentleman. And he
was.
Just like that. He wore this hat all the time. You know, we'd go out to eat. He'd wear that hat.
Yeah, he did.
But while we were talking about unfiltered, I just jogged a memory about Davis. You know, he told me a story once. he had a couple of puncheons of Pinot Noir that he was ready to bottle. So he had let them settle, and then he bottled them, bottled one puncheon, bottled the other. And then he found that one of the puncheons turned out just fine. I mean, it was clear. And the bottles were clear. The wine was fine. In the other bottles, it was more turbid. And so he was up the road visiting his old buddy, Louis Martini, famous winemaker whose name you might recognize.
Of course.
And he was telling Louis that he had a problem, and half the bottling, it was the same wine, just two different puncheons, and one settled and one didn't. And part of that's how Pinot is. Pinot can be really like that. It can be moody, And so anyway, he was telling Louis that he had this problem. One half of it bottled fine, the other half was cloudy. And Louis just looked at him and said, "Davis, that's not a problem. You just call that one unfiltered and you charge twice as much."
Exactly. That was the era, man.
I think he did.
I think he did, yeah. I know he did. He would have. He's no fool, Davis. He knew what to do. He was a remarkable guy. A super nice man. One of the time, I think Justin was telling the story. And I think I heard it from Davis too. He was pouring in London, and Stephen Spurrier, the famous man who just passed away a couple weeks ago, who held the Judgment of Paris, where the American wines beat the French wine. He was the one who set that up. Famous English, wonderful guy, super nice man. And he was and an open-minded guy. Never, he'd taste anything. He cared about wine. That's all. And he tasted Davis's wine in London, and he was stunned by how good it was. He thought, this is really good. He told Davis, your wines are fantastic. You need to go home and charge a lot more money for them. And he did. and he made him a little more famous because you're charging more money. People start to pay more attention.
Yeah.
But as Stephen Spurrier tells, he can't anymore, but he was a very nice man, Stephen Spurrier.
And
a really dapper, cool guy. Like Davis, kind of.
Like Davis. And back when Davis started, it was a handshake deal between him and the Rocciolis to buy that fruit. Yeah. Rocciolis were making $150 a ton on that fruit. I don't know what they sell it for now, but it's
it's 180 at least
north
now.
Of 8,000, 10. I don't know what it is, but he was paying. They were getting $150 a ton. It was an experimental plot, from what I understand.
Yeah.
They had orchards and all these other things going on. It wasn't just grapes. Right around our winery here at Rodney Strong, it was all plums. Hillsburg was the prune capital of the world, as they called it. So, things changed. Cherry orchards, apple orchards still, especially out in the Green Valley area, the Gravenstein apple orchards. So,
and famously, Joe Rocciolis didn't want to plant Pinot Noir on his property. He was upset. His kids wanted to plant Pinot Noir. He said, no, they plant their oldest vines are Sauvignon Blanc because that could sell. You could sell Sauvignon Blanc. You couldn't sell Pinot Noir. Finally, they went out and put in some Pinot Noir, which Davis bought, and then sort of helped put them on the map.
Yeah.
So he could get Rocchioli fruit as long as he was around. Doesn't matter how famous the Rocchioli's got. Doesn't matter the demand. Didn't matter how much money you had to throw around. Davis got his Pinot Noir every year because of their handshake deal that went back to the 70s.
And he paid him $350 a ton. They were making $150 originally, $300 a ton, like that.
Yeah.
A lot of money back then, just on a handshake.
Yep.
So, I think I might have told this in the FaceTime Instagram live that we did the other time. Face cram, yeah. Face
cram.
So Davis, he knew a guy at PG&E, a bigwig at PG&E. So he had moved in '65. He was making wine down in Albany, selling wine in jugs to the kids at Berkeley and all over the place, professors, the students, whatever. And then he ended up moving up, bought a vineyard in Napa Valley, owned that for a few years. He had an old Studebaker. I think Hampton told me it was a 46 Studebaker with a tank on the back, fermenting wine, driving up and down the road. He knew the TTB, the government guy. He knew the car that guy drove. And so if he pulled back up to his winery and saw his car parked out front, he just kept going.
Yeah, exactly.
The books weren't exactly straight. And, I think that probably went on for some years, but eventually, he sold that vineyard over in Napa, which is where Whitehall Lane is now, by the way.
Yep.
I said they were going to have him do an environmental impact report, and I don't know how many hundreds of people came out of the woodwork to sign a petition against him building a winery there back then. So it didn't happen, and he sold that property. He moved over to the Russian River after having a fateful dinner in 1972, December of '72, with the Allen family that lived right next to the Rocciolis. And they had a bottle of the homebrew Pinot on the table, and it just knocked him out. Yep. And that was the wine that did it for him. He found a plot of land, an old hop kiln that he turned into a winery. Within 1 year, the very next vintage in September, I assume, 1973, after the handshake deal with the Rocciolis, that fruit came in the door into the winery. Robert Stemler was a winemaker. He was consulting for Davis at the winery. Davis told me there was some story about the roof caught on fire, smoke had filled the building, all kinds of craziness, pandemonium going on. Yeah. And the Rocchioli fruit shows up, it's the first day of crush. And by the way, they got the whole place hooked up to power just the night before, only because Davis knew a bigwig at PG&E. Yeah. This big storm going on. I mean, it was a mess. So it all came in, and everything worked out. And Hampton ended up working for him, his son, and Gary Farrell, the next year was the winemaker. Ended up working for Davis, and then became the winemaker, and then spun off and started his own winery. And just he knew a whole number of other people.
Interesting guy. He was a great guy. Great guy to be around and fun guy. Yeah, another funny story. He told me when he sold the winery. Right, he wanted to sell the winery. And he and the city tells him, the county tells him, you can't sell the winery. You can't. And he said, "What do you mean I can't sell the winery?" I said, "Well, you don't have a tasting room permit." I said, I've had this taste. You guys have all been to my tasting room. I opened it like 50 years ago. He said, "Yeah, but you don't have a permit for it." He said, "Great. Give me the permit. Just give me the permit. I'll pay for the permit." And they said, "Well, we can't give you the permit." "What do you mean you can't give me the permit? I'll buy the permit." He said, "Well, your driveway isn't compliant. You don't have enough fuel in your driveway." "What do you mean I've had that driveway for 50 years. He goes, "Sorry, it's not compliant. So I have to rebuild my driveway to get the license to sell my winery?" And they said, "Yeah, pretty much that's about it." The only time I ever saw him angry was telling that story. He was livid because all these guys had been there. They all knew him. Man. But he did. He fixed the driveway. He got his license and he sold it to the Thomas George family. But oh man, it's a classic story. Well, thanks for putting up with us. I think we've. Anybody have any more questions? Please chime in. Thoughts about the wines, questions about clones. What are you having for dinner? I don't know. Whatever's going on, doesn't matter. Dachshunds. You got dachshund questions? I'm sick of dachshunds now. If not, thank you for joining us. World of Pinot Noir is like such a great event. I was lucky enough to go 1 year. Oh, here's a quick question. What's the difference between acidity and tannins?
Oh yeah, okay. Well, let me start, and you can chime in, Ron. So those are two of the main pillars of wine, but different pillars, although they affect each other. So that's what I want to get into. So if you deconstruct a wine, and there are, so I'm told, so I've read anyway, they figure that there's like tens of thousands of different compounds in wine. So it gets kind of scary
dogs.
how much there is. The dogs, yeah, there's a lot of dogs. So if you want to deconstruct it as best as like I can follow it anyway, and most of us, there is alcohol, and there is tannins, and then there is acidity, the acid, and there is fruit. You want to add any other pillar to that?
Oak.
Oak, okay, that's a good one. Yeah,
That's about
so
it.
we're gonna add, and so you have those main pillars of the wine. And remember, wine is mostly water, so 85% water, right? And then there's alcohol beyond that, and the last percent, if that, is everything that's
else.
different in all wines everywhere. So I want to throw that out there too. But the acid and the tannins, two major components, two major pillars of any wine. Including whites, I would argue. If you took the tannins out of a white wine, you probably would find it not so good. So they are there, but in the background. In a Pinot Noir, acid and tannins, or in any red wine, pretty much, those are things to look at. The acidity is just that; it's the acid. So you think vinegar per se, or lemon, or anything that your mouth's watering, right? Just mine is anyway. Just thinking about that. That's the acid. You know what that is. The tannins maybe is where. Some of you may or may not know, it's the grip that's on your tongue. And there's a huge family of tannins. It's like hexylmethyl chicken wire, as they say. It gets all over the place and really complicated really fast. Yeah. But there are 3 sources of tannins. And actually, going back to acid, there are, I don't know, 4 or 5 different acids. There's actually more than that, but there's the main ones. Yeah. Tartaric, by the way, as far as acid goes, is the heaviest and very almost unique to wine. I'm told... mangoes. Mangoes have tartaric acid, and I think there might be one other thing. Other than that, grapes are the main crop. Yeah, so it's tartaric. Beyond that, malic, which generally gets fermented into lactic acid. There's citric acid. Some of that gets, some or all that gets fermented down too. Succinic. So you do have these different acids in the wine. The total of that we're just going to call the acidity. And then the tannins. There's the family. You get them from the oak. You get them from the grape skins, and you get them from the grape seeds, most importantly.
The stems.
And the stems, yeah, good point. And so the tannins will bind with color, which is another family, believe it or not. If you've seen Malbec, you've seen bluish tinted wine, or cabs that are bluish tinted a little bit, maybe. Not too much, but Malbec more, Petit Verdot. So you've seen different color in wines. Some of them have names you might recognize. Delphinidin, Petunidin, sound like flowers, right? So these things are out in nature and other things. And so you've got color molecules, they'll bind with the tannins, and they'll cap those tannins off and make them softer. So one of the things as a winemaker I'm looking at, and I can kind of promote that through a little bit of heat, in the fermentation. I can promote that kind of binding, and that's a stylistic tool. It's a little nudge that I can do. The bigger nudge is really, the big thing is what Mother Nature gave us. And it's what we're going to deal with year in and year out. But the tannins are the grip on your tongue. They can be smoother. They can be fine. If you think of sandpaper, fine sandpaper, or grittier and grittier, there's a lot of words that are used to describe it. I use chewy sometimes, moderately chewy, slightly chewy, so a lot of terminology.
I think of it as a dachshund with peanut butter. They're doing. You give a dog peanut butter, and they do that. That's the tannic acid. When you feel like your mouth's doing that, that's the tannins. And the other thing to quickly talk about it is why does the plant? Why are there so much tannins in grapes and in the plant? And for the plant. Because the grapes and the skins and all that are covered in tannins. If an animal goes out and tries to eat grapes that aren't ripe, they're so bitter that they won't eat them. Yeah. And this is a way so then as the plant accumulates sugar and the seed matures, and now it's a viable seed to reproduce, then that sugar accumulation, this turn color as sort of to tell the plants, to tell the predators, to tell the things that eat it and spread the seed, okay, here's your reward. So now you have enough sugar for the birds or the boar or whoever comes and eats them. They'll eat them pleasantly and then go poop the seed over here, and it may germinate. So the tannins are a defense mechanism for the plant to keep their reproductive organs, the fruit, from being eaten too early.
And the acidity too.
And the acidity too.
High acidity.
Yeah.
So guess what? As it ripens, the acid, maybe I'll go this way. The acid, I'm doing it backwards for your benefit.
Like this.
Yeah. The acid, as the grapes ripen, the sugar's coming up and up, and the acid's coming down and down.
Right.
Like Ron's saying, to advertise to nature, to allow the animals and insects to come eat them. There's a lot of chemical messaging that's going on there, visual, and things that the insects and the animals can sense, maybe that we don't or aren't paying attention to. I don't know. Maybe we can't. I don't know. But so the tannins also are changing qualitatively, that is, maybe quantitatively too, in the grapes. So the tannins are changing, and it's one of the things that I do and winemakers all do when you're out, you're tasting. And so you're tasting for the balance. You can sense the acid. Wine grapes, you might be surprised to know, they're smaller than table grapes in general, and they're much, much sweeter.
Yeah.
So the acidity you're looking at, but it's kind of buried under a whole lot of sugar. And then the tannins are there. And Pinot Noir, I definitely don't want to pick Pinot before those tannins get away from a chalkiness.
Right.
I don't want them to be chalky. Between these two clones, the one that'll hang on to that a little farther is the Swiss clone, clone 23. So the thicker skins, and now you have to wait on that. And the Dijon clone 667 is what we'll be out there picking first.
Well, I think that's enough. Thanks, everybody. We appreciate it. Please come see us when you come to Sonoma County. You can taste the Davis Bynum wines at Rodney Strong Vineyards. So please come by and taste some wines with us next time you're up here. It'd be fun.
I think they can order.
We still have our special.
The special.
Do you have that, Alyssa? Do you have that quick slide? Thank you, Greg.
Yeah, it's still April.
That end slide.
April 18th. You can continue to buy the wines if you like.
We'd love to have your email address. We love email addresses. Yeah, join us on Facebook and Insta Facebook and Twittergram and. I don't know. I'm not much of a tech guy.
Keep up on the latest and greatest with Davis Bynum and what we're doing. Yeah, you can look at us through the mailing list or the.
No, we had the promo code, so you can. The World of Pinot Noir promo code is still valid through April 18th.
Yeah,
so you can get these wines at a deal and reorder them. They're terrific wines. They're just delicious. So that's a great price, by the way, we did for World of Pinot Noir. So take advantage of it. And it's free shipping too. So what's wrong with that?
Hey.
So that's all good. Thanks again, everyone. Glad you caught me on that. I'd have gotten a lot of nasty emails from the marketing people, and that would have been really ugly.
I'm here for you, Ron.
I know, but it would have been my fault. So thank you, everyone. Maybe we'll see you in person next year at World of Pinot Noir. I hope so.
Yeah, and thank you from my heart too for joining in.
Thanks for joining us. Take care. We'll see you.